D. I don't know where you're listening from. Maybe you're serving tables right now, polishing glasses with tired hands, or waiting for someone to finally say thank you. It doesn't matter what time it is or where you are in this vast world. Today's story will shake your heart, reminding you that true worth often hides beneath the surface, in voices unheard and kindness unseen. Her name was Rosa Martinez, and she carried Chicago's autumn mornings in the rhythm of her footsteps. At 38, her hands bore the honest calluses of 7 years behind the espresso machine at Café Luna, a modest place tucked between towering glass buildings on North Clark Street. The cafe smelled perpetually of fresh coffee, beans, and warm milk, a constant embrace that welcomed lawyers rushing to court, students with their laptops, and businessmen who saw Rosa as part of the furniture, reliable, quiet, invisible. Rosa's grandmother had taught her that dignity wasn't something you wore like jewelry. It lived in how you treated others when no one was watching. Those words echoed in her mind every morning as she tied her black apron, checked her ponytail in the small mirror by the coffee machine, and prepared to serve people who would never know her story. Her brown eyes held depth that most customers never bothered to notice, and her smile, genuine despite everything, had become her armor against a world that often forgot she was human. The cafe's morning symphony began at 6:30 sharp. The hiss of the espresso machine, the gentle clink of ceramic cups, the whispered conversations of people building empires over lattes. Rosa moved through it all like a dancer who knew every step by heart, her movements efficient yet graceful, pouring coffee with the same care a sculptor might use to shape clay. She remembered every regular's order, Mr. Peterson's double shot with oat milk, Sarah from the accounting firm who always needed extra foam, the young mother who juggled her baby while ordering a vanilla cappuccino to go. But Rosa carried more than just coffee orders in her memory. She held fragments of overheard conversations, pieces of lives lived in rushed moments between meetings. Her grandmother's voice whispered again, "Mija, God gave you ears not just to hear, but to understand." Rosa understood Russian as fluently as Spanish, a gift from her grandmother who had fled Ukraine in her youth, carrying stories and language across oceans. This linguistic inheritance would prove to be more valuable than any fortune hidden in offshore accounts. On this particular October morning, rain drummed against the cafe's large windows, creating a cocoon of warmth inside while Chicago's financial district awakened outside. The smell of wet pavement mixed with coffee created that distinct urban perfume that Rosa had grown to love. She watched the steam rise from freshly brewed cups, each swirl carrying the dreams and anxieties of another day in the city that never stopped moving. Rosa's life had been shaped by sacrifice long before she understood what the word meant. Born in Pilsen, Chicago's vibrant Mexican-American neighborhood, she had learned early that love often wore work clothes and spoke in tired whispers at the end of long days. Her mother cleaned offices downtown while her father worked construction, their combined income barely covering rent for their small apartment above a bakery that filled their home with the scent of fresh bread each morning. When Rosa was 16, her father suffered a back injury that ended his construction career. Without hesitation, she left high school to work full-time. Her dreams of studying business administration folded away like winter clothes in summer. She told herself it was temporary, just until her father recovered, just until her younger brother finished school, just until the medical bills were paid. But temporary has a way of becoming permanent when you're trying to hold a family together with minimum wage paychecks and pure determination. The early years were a blur of different jobs: cashier at a grocery store, cleaning homes in affluent neighborhoods, waitressing at a diner that smelled like grease and broken dreams. Each position taught her something new about invisibility. She learned that people talked freely around service workers as if their uniforms made them deaf and blind to secrets. She discovered that wealthy clients often discussed million-dollar investments while she cleaned their bathrooms, their voices carrying through thin walls like smoke. When Rosa finally found her place at Café Luna, It felt like coming home to a family she had chosen. The owner, Mrs. Chen, was a 60-year-old Taiwanese immigrant who understood the weight of starting over in a foreign language. She paid fairly, offered health insurance after 6 months, and treated her employees like human beings rather than replaceable parts in a machine designed to serve coffee and collect profits. Within months, Rosa had memorized not just orders, but preferences, allergies, and the small kindnesses that made regular customers feel seen. She remembered that Mr. Johnson liked his coffee extra hot because he had a long commute, that Dana, the graduate student, was saving money and appreciated when Rosa occasionally forgot to charge for that extra shot of espresso, that the elderly couple from the bookstore next door always shared a muffin and needed 2 forks without being asked. Her coworkers respected her quiet efficiency and her ability to handle difficult customers with grace that never cracked, even when faced with condescension or outright rudeness. Rosa had mastered the art of letting insults slide off her like rain on a well-waxed car, protecting her inner peace while maintaining the professional smile that management expected. She had learned that dignity wasn't something others could take away. It was something you gifted to yourself every morning when you chose to treat your work as worthy, regardless of how others perceived it. But Rosa's greatest strength lay in her ability to listen, really listen, to the world around her. While other employees chatted during slow periods or lost themselves in their phones, Rosa absorbed the rhythm of the cafe like a musician studying a complex symphony. She noticed when regular customers seemed stressed, when someone was celebrating good news, when a person appeared lost or lonely. Her grandmother's voice echoed again. Compassion, mija, is seeing what others choose to ignore. This morning felt different from the moment Rosa unlocked the cafe doors. The air held that electric tension that precedes significant change, like the moment before thunder rolls across Lake Michigan. She prepared the morning's first batch of coffee with extra care, grinding beans that had been roasted just yesterday by a small company in Logan Square. The familiar ritual grounded her, measuring, timing, adjusting the grind until the extraction flowed like liquid amber into pristine white cups. As the morning rush began, Rosa moved through her routine with practiced elegance. She served the early commuters, the ones who needed caffeine before they could remember their own names, with patient understanding. She watched the sun struggle through rain-heavy clouds, casting shifting shadows across tables where deals worth millions of dollars would soon be discussed in languages she wasn't supposed to understand. By 8 o'clock, the cafe had filled with its usual mix of Chicago's working population, young professionals clutching smartphones like lifelines, older executives who still preferred newspapers to digital screens, freelance writers claiming corner tables for hours-long writing sessions fueled by endless refills. The conversations created a multilingual tapestry, English dominated, but Rosa caught fragments of Spanish from construction workers grabbing coffee before job sites opened, Mandarin from students at nearby Northwestern's downtown campus, and occasionally the Russian that always made her pause and remember. It was then that Aaron Blake walked through the door, and Rosa felt the atmosphere shift like barometric pressure before a storm. Aaron commanded attention without trying, 6 feet tall, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Rosa earned in 3 months, with steel gray hair that suggested distinguished experience rather than age. His handmade Italian leather shoes clicked against the cafe's worn wooden floors with the confidence of a man accustomed to walking on marble and mahogany. Aaron Blake owned 40% of the commercial real estate between the Loop and Lincoln Park, with investment portfolios that included everything from cryptocurrency ventures to renewable energy stocks. His net worth fluctuated daily by amounts that exceeded most people's annual salaries, yet he carried himself with the casual arrogance of someone who had never questioned whether his next meal was guaranteed. He collected expensive watches, owned a penthouse overlooking Millennium Park, and drove a Tesla that cost more than many people's homes. But wealth had not filled the emptiness that echoed through his daily routine. Aaron lived alone in spaces designed by acclaimed architects, yet felt no warmth. His relationships were transactional. Business partnerships, social obligations, carefully orchestrated encounters with women who saw dollar signs rather than the lonely man behind the fortune. He worked 16-hour days not from passion, but from the fear that stillness might force him to confront the hollow ache where purpose should have resided. Aaron chose Café Luna not for its ambiance or superior coffee, but because it was convenient to his office and consistently quiet enough for business calls. He viewed Rosa and her colleagues as efficient background elements, like well-programmed software that delivered caffeine without requiring emotional investment. He had never bothered to learn her name, despite visiting 3 times a week for over a year. To him, she was simply the waitress, competent, unobtrusive, forgettable. This morning, Aaron claimed his usual table near the window, where rain still streaked the glass like tears Chicago couldn't stop shedding. He ordered his standard double espresso, checked his phone for overnight market movements, and prepared for a call that would determine the financial future of thousands of investors who trusted their retirement savings to his fund management company. The irony was lost on him. A man worth hundreds of millions making decisions that could devastate families struggling to save enough for their children's college educations. Rosa approached his table with the coffee, her movements smooth and professional, despite the growing weight of another day's invisible labor. She had served Aaron Blake dozens of times, had listened to him conduct business calls in English, had watched him dismiss servers with barely a glance, had witnessed his casual indifference to everyone whose net worth didn't match his own. Yet she continued to serve him with the same care she offered every customer, because her grandmother had taught her that kindness wasn't conditional on reciprocal respect. As Rosa placed the espresso cup on Aaron's table, she noticed him glancing at his phone with unusual intensity. His jaw tensed, his free hand drummed against the table's wooden surface, and his usually controlled expression showed cracks of anxiety. Something was wrong in Aaron Blake's carefully constructed world of assets and investments, and Rosa felt an unexpected flutter of human concern for someone who had never acknowledged her humanity. Aaron's phone rang at precisely 8:27, and Rosa found herself wiping nearby tables with affected concentration, her trained ears automatically tuning into conversations that others ignored. The voice on the other end spoke in rapid, urgent Russian, and Rosa felt her heartbeat accelerate as familiar syllables reached her consciousness. Her grandmother's language, the secret tongue of their shared heritage, was being used to discuss something that made Aaron Blake's confident facade finally crack completely. The conversation was brief, but intense. Rosa caught fragments that made her hands tremble as she continued her cleaning routine. Stock manipulation, insider information, SEC investigation, and most chilling of all, pension fund targets. Her grandmother's voice whispered warnings. When you hear evil being planned, silence becomes complicity. Rosa felt destiny settling around her shoulders like a heavy coat, understanding that this moment would define not just her own future, but the financial security of countless innocent people. Aaron ended the call and noticed Rosa nearby, her face pale with concentration. For the first time in over a year of regular service, he really looked at her, not as background scenery, but as a potential threat to his carefully guarded privacy. His expression shifted from anxiety to suspicion, then to the cruel amusement of a man who believed his secrets were safe because he had underestimated everyone around him. "Enjoying the show?" Aaron asked, his voice carrying the condescending edge of privilege talking down to perceived insignificance. "I don't suppose you understood any of that, though I did notice you listening rather intently." Rosa felt heat rise in her cheeks, not from embarrassment, but from the familiar sting of being dismissed as intellectually inferior because she served coffee rather than commanded boardrooms. She had experienced this condescension thousands of times, customers who spoke about her as if she couldn't hear, who assumed her uniform meant she lacked intelligence, who treated service workers like furniture with the inconvenient ability to witness their lives. "I was just cleaning, sir," Rosa replied quietly, her voice carrying the practiced neutrality of someone who had learned to swallow pride for the sake of steady employment. But something in her tone must have betrayed her understanding, because Aaron's amusement sharpened into something colder. "Right," Aaron said slowly, his gray eyes studying Rosa with new attention. "Well, I suppose it doesn't matter what you think you heard. After all, who would believe a waitress claiming to understand international business conversations?" The dismissal hit Rosa like a physical blow, not because it was unusual, but because it came at the moment when she held information that could save countless people from financial ruin. She thought of her neighbors in Pilsen, hard-working families who trusted their modest savings to retirement plans, who believed that pension funds were safe investments managed by honest people. She thought of her own parents, whose small nest egg represented decades of sacrifice and careful budgeting. Aaron gathered his things, left a minimal tip despite ordering the most expensive item on the menu, and walked away without another glance in Rosa's direction. He had no idea that his casual cruelty had just transformed an invisible waitress into the most dangerous person in his carefully constructed world of financial deception. Rosa stood frozen by the window table, watching rain continue its relentless assault on Chicago's glass towers. In her hands, she held the future, knowledge that could prevent a massive financial crime, information that could save retirement funds and pension plans from calculated theft. But she also held the weight of her own vulnerability, understanding that powerful men like Aaron Blake had ways of destroying people who threatened their empires. The cafe continued its morning rhythm around her, customers ordering lattes and bagels, while Rosa contemplated a choice that would either define her as a hero or destroy the quiet life she had built through years of patient struggle. Her grandmother's voice whispered one final time, "Courage, Misha, is not the absence of fear. It is doing what is right despite the fear." Rosa made her decision with the same quiet determination that had carried her through years of invisible labor. She would not let Aaron Blake's arrogance and cruelty prevent her from protecting people who deserved honesty from those they trusted with their financial futures. The waitress, who had been dismissed as insignificant, was about to prove that true power often resided in the most unexpected places. The morning shift continued around Rosa as she moved through familiar motions with newfound purpose. Every cup she served, every table she cleaned, every smile she offered to hurried customers carried the weight of her secret knowledge. She had become the guardian of information that could topple financial empires, and she bore that responsibility with the same grace she brought to serving coffee to people who rarely bothered to remember her name. As lunch hour approached and the cafe's atmosphere shifted from morning urgency to midday conversations, Rosa began formulating a plan that would require all the courage her grandmother had spent years helping her cultivate. She thought of her parents sleeping peacefully in their small apartment, unaware that their daughter was about to step onto a stage where millionaires and waitresses played for stakes higher than most people could imagine. The rain had stopped by noon, and weak sunlight struggled through Chicago's signature gray clouds, casting everything in the muted tones of a city that had learned to find beauty in industrial shadows. Rosa stood at the espresso machine, preparing drinks with mechanical precision while her mind raced through possibilities and consequences. She understood that her next actions would either validate her grandmother's faith in the power of quiet courage or confirm Aaron Blake's assumption that waitresses were too insignificant to matter in the games that wealthy men played. But Rosa Martinez had never been insignificant to the people who knew her heart. She had been the daughter who sacrificed her education for her family's stability, the employee who treated every customer with dignity regardless of how they treated her, the neighbor who checked on elderly residents during harsh Chicago winters, the woman who had learned to find strength in service rather than shame. Now, she would discover whether that strength was enough to challenge a system designed to silence voices like hers. The afternoon crowd began filtering in as Rosa prepared to cross a line that divided her old life from whatever came next. She thought of all the customers she had served who discussed their hopes and fears over coffee, unknowing that their waitress understood more than they imagined. She thought of the trust they placed in financial advisors and investment managers, assuming that regulations and oversight protected their modest savings from the greed of people like Aaron Blake. As she wiped down the espresso machine for what might be the last time as an anonymous service worker, Rosa felt the weight of transformation settling around her like Chicago wind before a thunderstorm. She had always been more than just a waitress, more than just an invisible woman in a black apron serving coffee to people who controlled the city's financial destiny. Tomorrow, Aaron Blake and everyone else would learn that the most dangerous person in any room is often the one that powerful men assume is too insignificant to matter. The rain returned as evening approached, drumming against Cafe Luna's windows like applause for a performance that was just beginning. Rosa finished her shift, hung up her apron, and stepped into the Chicago night carrying secrets that could change everything. She had no way of knowing that her journey from invisible waitress to reluctant hero would take her through months of doubt, betrayal, and loneliness before delivering her to a redemption that would honor every sacrifice her grandmother had made to bring their family to this moment of moral reckoning. But first, Rosa had to find someone who would believe that a Mexican-American waitress could understand Russian well enough to overhear financial crimes and care enough about strangers to risk her livelihood for their protection. In a city where power usually wore expensive suits and commanded boardrooms, Rosa was about to discover whether justice could find a voice in someone whose greatest qualification was the courage to listen when others chose to remain silent. The next morning arrived with the kind of bone-deep cold that only Chicago could deliver in late October. The kind that made coffee shops feel like sanctuaries against a world determined to test human endurance. Rosa arrived at Cafe Luna 30 minutes early, as she had every day for 7 years, but this morning carried the weight of sleepless hours spent rehearsing conversations that could either save thousands of people or destroy her own carefully constructed life. She had spent the night researching financial journalists, looking through newspaper websites and business magazines for someone who might take her seriously, despite her lack of credentials in their world of suits and stock portfolios. Her laptop, purchased secondhand 3 years ago with money saved from tips, sat open on her kitchen table, displaying articles about pension fund fraud, SEC investigations, and the complex web of regulation designed to protect average investors from exactly the kind of scheme she had overheard in Russian. The cafe's morning preparation ritual provided comfort through familiarity, checking the espresso machine's pressure, arranging pastries in the display case, wiping down tables that would soon hold the dreams and anxieties of another day's worth of customers. But Rosa's hands shook slightly as she worked, betraying the anxiety that her professional smile couldn't quite hide. She was about to cross a bridge that could never be uncrossed, moving from witness to whistleblower in a justice system that didn't always protect people who chose to do the right thing. At 7:15, just as Rosa finished brewing the day's first batch of coffee, she noticed a familiar figure settling into a corner table with a newspaper and laptop. David Chen, no relation to the cafe's owner, was a financial reporter for the Chicago Tribune who spent most mornings working from Cafe Luna, sustained by endless refills and the kind of background noise that helped him concentrate. Rosa had served him hundreds of cups of coffee over 2 years, had listened to him conduct phone interviews with economists and financial analysts, had observed his genuine concern for how policy changes affected working families. David was different from most of the cafe's business customers. He asked about Rosa's day, remembered details about her life that she had mentioned in passing, left generous tips not from guilt, but from respect for honest work. He treated service workers like human beings rather than conveniences, a quality that Rosa had noticed and appreciated, even when she had no idea how important that respect would become. Taking a deep breath that carried the aroma of fresh coffee and her grandmother's whispered encouragement, Rosa approached David's table with a carafe of his preferred dark roast and enough courage to change both their lives forever. "Good morning, David," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Could I talk to you about something when you have a few minutes? It's important." David looked up from his laptop with the immediate attention that good journalists gave to unexpected stories, but his expression showed genuine concern for Rosa rather than professional opportunism. He had always sensed depth in the waitress, who served his coffee with unusual grace, had noticed the intelligence in her eyes that suggested education interrupted rather than education absent. "Of course, Rosa. Is everything okay?" The simple question, asked with authentic care, nearly broke Rosa's carefully maintained composure. When had anyone in her professional life last asked if she was okay and meant it? When had a customer shown interest in her well-being rather than just the speed of her service? The kindness in David's voice reminded her why she was taking this enormous risk, because some people still cared about protecting others even when protection required personal sacrifice. "I overheard something yesterday," Rosa began quietly, glancing around to ensure their conversation remained private. "A customer was discussing something in Russian, something about stock manipulation and pension funds. I think people might get hurt if someone doesn't investigate." David's journalist instincts sharpened immediately, but his response reflected the ethical training that separated real reporters from sensationalists. He didn't dismiss Rosa's concerns because she worked in food service, didn't question her ability to understand complex financial conversations, didn't assume that her uniform meant she lacked intelligence or integrity. Instead, he listened with the respect that her information deserved. "Tell me exactly what you heard," David said, closing his laptop to give Rosa his full attention. "And don't worry about whether you understood everything correctly. I can help figure out the technical details." For the next 20 minutes, Rosa recounted her conversation with Aaron Blake, the Russian phone call, and the fragments of conspiracy she had understood. David took notes with increasing intensity, asking clarifying questions about timing, specific words she had heard, and details about Aaron's behavior that might help establish the credibility of her account. As Rosa spoke, she felt the strange liberation that comes with sharing a burden that had become too heavy to carry alone. David's questions were professional but respectful, treating her testimony with the seriousness it deserved rather than the skepticism she had expected. For the first time since overhearing Aaron's conversation, Rosa allowed herself to hope that doing the right thing might actually lead to justice rather than personal destruction. "This is serious, Rosa," David said when she finished her account. "If what you heard is accurate, we're talking about a massive fraud scheme that could affect thousands of pension fund investors. But I need to be honest. Investigating someone like Aaron Blake requires significant proof, and his legal team will attack the credibility of any accusations." Rosa felt her heart sink as the reality of her situation crystallized. She was a waitress with a high school education, attempting to expose a millionaire with teams of lawyers, accountants, and public relations specialists. Her word against his would be weighted on scales that had never favored people like her, in courtrooms where power mattered more than truth. "I know it seems impossible," Rosa said quietly. "But I couldn't live with myself if I stayed silent while people lost their retirement savings to fraud. My grandmother taught me that doing what's right isn't always easy, but it's always necessary." David studied Rosa's face, seeing the determination that had carried her through years of sacrifice and the moral courage that compelled her to risk everything for strangers who would never know her name. He had interviewed hundreds of sources over his career, but few had impressed him with the combination of credibility and character that Rosa displayed. "I believe you," David said simply, "and I'm going to help you expose this, whatever it takes. But you need to understand that this investigation could take months, and Aaron Blake will probably figure out that you're the source of the information. Are you prepared for what that might mean?" Rosa thought of her parents, her co-workers, her modest apartment, and the quiet life she had built through careful sacrifice. She thought of the retirement savings that honest families trusted to financial managers, the pension funds that represented decades of labor from people who deserved better than calculated theft. She thought of her grandmother's voice, whispering across years and continents about courage, dignity, and the responsibility that comes with witnessing injustice. "I'm prepared," Rosa said, though she had no idea how completely Aaron Blake's revenge would demolish the life she had spent years building. The next 3 months transformed Rosa's existence into a careful balance between normal routines and clandestine meetings with David and his research team. They met in different locations, a library branch in Humboldt Park, a diner in Chinatown, once in Millennium Park where conversations could disappear into Lake Michigan wind. David's investigation grew methodically, building a case that required documentation beyond Rosa's testimony. The breakthrough came in January, when another Russian conversation at Café Luna provided the specific details David needed to trace Aaron's fraud through financial records. Rosa had developed an instinct for when Aaron's business calls would involve his co-conspirators, and she positioned herself strategically to overhear conversations that most people would dismiss as incomprehensible background noise. But rumors began circulating through the cafe's small staff that Rosa was acting strange, staying late to eavesdrop on customers, asking too many questions about people who weren't her business. Her co-worker Jennifer, who had always resented Rosa's popularity with customers and management, began watching Rosa's behavior with increasing suspicion and jealousy. The investigation's momentum accelerated when David discovered financial records that corroborated Rosa's account of the pension fund scheme. Aaron Blake's investment firm had been systematically diverting retirement savings into high-risk ventures that generated enormous fees regardless of whether investors made or lost money. The conspiracy was elegantly simple and devastatingly effective. Steal from people who trusted you, hide the theft in complex financial instruments, and rely on victims' lack of sophistication to prevent discovery. As winter deepened and David's exposé neared publication, Rosa began experiencing the psychological toll of maintaining secrets that could destroy a powerful man while continuing to serve him coffee with professional courtesy. Aaron's visits to the cafe became tests of her composure, his casual arrogance a constant reminder of how little he valued people like her. Then, on a February morning that would shatter Rosa's world, Jennifer made her move. Driven by jealousy and the promise of reward from Aaron Blake's security team, she fabricated a story about Rosa stealing from customers, embezzling from the register, and conducting some kind of scheme involving business clients. The lies were convincing enough to create doubt, and doubt was all Aaron needed to destroy Rosa's reputation. Rosa learned about the accusations when Mrs. Chen called her into the office before her shift began. The conversation was brief and devastating. Customer complaints, missing money, inappropriate behavior with clients, immediate termination. Rosa's protests fell on ears that had been poisoned by carefully crafted lies, and her 7 years of faithful service evaporated in 10 minutes of manufactured scandal. Standing in the alley behind Café Luna, holding her personal belongings in a cardboard box, Rosa felt the full weight of Aaron Blake's power. He had destroyed her livelihood without even acknowledging her existence, had used her co-workers' jealousy as a weapon to silence the one person who threatened his financial empire. The rain that began falling seemed like Chicago's tears for another injustice that would probably never be corrected. But David Chen wasn't finished with his investigation, and Rosa's firing only strengthened his conviction that Aaron Blake was exactly the kind of criminal who destroyed honest lives to protect dishonest wealth. The article appeared 3 weeks later, front page of the Chicago Tribune's business section, with a headline that sent shockwaves through the city's financial district. Local investment firm accused of massive pension fund fraud. The story detailed Aaron's scheme with devastating precision, including quotes from an unnamed source who had overheard conspirators discussing their criminal activities in Russian. Rosa read the article in her apartment, feeling simultaneously vindicated and terrified as she recognized her own testimony translated into journalistic language that newspapers could print and prosecutors could use. Aaron Blake's response was swift and predictable. Deny everything, attack the newspaper's credibility, hire expensive lawyers to threaten lawsuits against anyone who repeated the accusations. His public relations team portrayed him as the victim of a vindictive journalist and unreliable sources who were probably motivated by personal grudges rather than legitimate concerns about financial misconduct. For 6 months, the case moved through legal channels, while Rosa struggled to find employment in an industry where Aaron's influence could destroy reputations with a few phone calls. Her savings disappeared, her apartment lease became a monthly anxiety, and her parents' concern added guilt to the financial pressure that threatened to crush her spirit. The vindication came nearly a year after Rosa's firing, when federal investigators arrested Aaron Blake on 17 counts of securities fraud, conspiracy, and theft from pension funds. The evidence that prosecutors presented in court included recorded conversations that proved Rosa's testimony with devastating accuracy. Aaron and his conspirators had indeed planned to steal millions of dollars from retirement accounts, just as the disgraced waitress had claimed. David Chen's follow-up articles traced the investigation's progress, always referring to the original source who had risked everything to expose the fraud. Rosa remained anonymous in print, but her courage had protected thousands of investors from financial ruin, had preserved retirement savings that represented lifelong dreams of dignity in old age. Aaron Blake's empire crumbled with appropriate drama. Assets frozen, investments seized, a reputation built over decades destroyed by the truth that a Mexican-American waitress had been brave enough to expose. His penthouse was sold to pay legal fees, his expensive cars repossessed by banks. His social circle evaporated as wealth disappeared and scandal replaced respectability. But personal destruction awaited Aaron in forms that transcended financial loss. Sitting in his lawyer's office, reviewing plea agreements that would send him to federal prison for 8 to 10 years, Aaron finally understood the cost of dismissing people whose humanity he had never bothered to acknowledge. The waitress he had treated as furniture had possessed the moral courage that his millions couldn't purchase, and the integrity that his success had gradually corrupted. The realization of what he had lost, not money or status, but connection to basic human decency, hit Aaron like lake-effect snow, sudden and overwhelming. He had been surrounded by wealth but isolated from wisdom, protected by financial power but vulnerable to the spiritual poverty that comes from treating other people as disposable conveniences. 2 years after Rosa's firing, Aaron Blake was released early from federal prison for cooperation with authorities in related fraud cases. His world had shrunk to a studio apartment in a neighborhood he had once considered beneath notice, a part-time job that barely covered basic expenses, and the daily challenge of rebuilding an identity that hadn't been based on stock portfolios and real estate holdings. The first place Aaron visited after his release was Café Luna, where new management had replaced Mrs. Chen, and different faces served coffee to customers who probably never thought about the invisible workers who sustained their daily routines. Aaron sat at his old table, drinking watery coffee that cost more than he could easily afford, remembering how casually he had dismissed the waitress whose courage had ultimately saved him from committing even worse crimes. Finding Rosa required the kind of persistent effort that Aaron had once applied to acquiring wealth. He traced her through mutual acquaintances, community organizations, and the network of invisible connections that bound Chicago's working families together. The search led him to a small diner in Logan Square, where Rosa worked night shifts serving coffee and comfort food to people who understood struggle as a daily reality rather than abstract concept. The reunion was wordless at first. Two people whose lives had been forever changed by a conversation overheard in Russian, by the courage of someone who had been dismissed as insignificant, by the devastating consequences of treating another human being as disposable furniture. Aaron stood in the doorway of Rosa's new workplace, older and humbled, while Rosa approached with the professional courtesy she offered all customers, regardless of their history or her feelings about their presence. "I owe you an apology," Aaron said quietly, his voice carrying none of the arrogance that had once defined his interactions with service workers. "And gratitude, and more than I could ever repay." Rosa studied his face, seeing genuine remorse where entitled condescension used to live. Recognizing the humanity that wealth and power had once concealed behind expensive suits and casual cruelty. She had learned through their shared ordeal that dignity couldn't be taken away by others. It could only be given away by yourself, and she had never surrendered hers despite everything he had cost her. "I did what I thought was right," Rosa replied simply, her words carrying the strength that had sustained her through months of unemployment, public doubt, and personal sacrifice. "I'm glad it helped stop you from hurting more people." They talked for 20 minutes while Rosa continued working, serving other customers with the same grace she had always brought to her profession. Aaron learned about her struggles finding employment after their scandal, her parents' support during the worst periods, her quiet satisfaction in knowing that thousands of investors had kept retirement savings that would have been stolen if she had remained silent. Before leaving, Aaron asked Rosa what he could do to make amends for the damage his arrogance had caused. Her answer surprised him with its simplicity and wisdom. She wanted nothing for herself, but asked him to remember how it felt to be dismissed as unworthy of basic respect. If he could learn to see service workers as human beings rather than convenient appliances, her suffering would have served a purpose beyond just exposing financial fraud. The foundation Aaron established in Rosa's honor became his path toward redemption, supporting immigrant women and service workers who faced discrimination and exploitation. He dedicated the rest of his working life to advocacy rather than accumulation, using his understanding of financial systems to protect people like Rosa rather than prey upon them. Rosa returned to college in her 40s, using money from the foundation to study business administration and nonprofit management. She graduated summa cum laude, spoke at commencement about the dignity of service work, and established programs to help other women transition from service jobs to careers that matched their intelligence and ambition. 5 years after their reunion, Rosa and Aaron collaborated on financial literacy programs for working families, their partnership a testament to the possibility of redemption through genuine respect for human dignity. Aaron never forgot the lesson that Rosa had taught him. That true worth had nothing to do with bank account balances and everything to do with how you treated people when you thought no one important was watching. Time passed gently after that, carrying Rosa through seasons of recognition and respect that honored every sacrifice her grandmother had made to bring their family to America. She received letters from investors whose retirement savings had been protected, from students who had benefited from her educational programs, from service workers who had found careers after following paths that Rosa's courage had helped create. Rosa lived peacefully in a home she purchased with money earned through work that valued her intelligence rather than just her ability to serve coffee. She kept a photograph of her grandmother on her kitchen table, next to articles about financial fraud prevention and letters from people whose lives had been changed by her willingness to risk everything for strangers who deserved protection from those who would exploit their trust. But Rosa's story didn't end with personal success and professional vindication. The ripple effects of her courage continued expanding like waves from a stone dropped into still water, touching lives she would never know about, inspiring other people to find their own voices when faced with moral choices that tested their character against their comfort. Maria Santos, a hotel housekeeper in Miami, read about Rosa's story in a Spanish-language newspaper and found the courage to report sexual harassment that had been ignored by management for years. Her complaint led to an investigation that protected dozens of other women and resulted in policy changes that made the workplace safer for everyone who cleaned rooms and changed sheets, while guests talked around them as if they were invisible. James Thompson, a security guard at an Atlanta office building, overheard conversations about insurance fraud that could have cost his company millions of dollars and left hundreds of employees without jobs. Remembering Rosa's example, he contacted authorities despite knowing that whistleblowing might cost him his own employment. His testimony helped prosecutors convict executives who had been willing to destroy their company rather than admit financial mismanagement. Elena Popov, a house cleaner in Seattle, discovered that her wealthy clients were hiding assets to avoid paying taxes that funded schools and hospitals in communities where her own children lived. She spent months gathering evidence while continuing to dust furniture and vacuum carpets in homes worth more than she would earn in several lifetimes. Her information helped tax authorities recover millions of dollars that belonged in public coffers rather than hidden offshore accounts. These stories multiplied across the country as Rosa's example inspired other invisible workers to realize that their observations mattered, that their voices carried moral weight that couldn't be measured in salary figures or social status. The network of people who cleaned, served, guarded, and maintained the infrastructure of American prosperity began understanding that their proximity to powerful people gave them unique responsibilities to protect the broader community from corruption and exploitation. Rosa received letters from some of these people, thanking her for proving that ordinary courage could challenge extraordinary power. She kept each letter in a special box, reading them when doubt crept into her thoughts, when she wondered whether her sacrifice had been worth the years of struggle and uncertainty that had followed her decision to speak truth to power. The financial literacy programs that Rosa and Aaron developed together became models for similar initiatives in other cities, teaching working families how to protect their savings from fraudulent schemes and recognize when financial advisors were acting in their own interests rather than their clients' benefit. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. A former financial criminal and the waitress who had exposed him working together to help people understand systems designed to benefit the wealthy at everyone else's expense. During one of their program presentations at a community center in Rosa's old neighborhood of Pilsen, an elderly man approached them after the session ended. He introduced himself as Manuel Rodriguez, explaining that his pension fund had been one of those targeted by Aaron's scheme before Rosa's testimony stopped the fraud. The money that Rosa's courage had saved would allow him to retire with dignity, to help his grandchildren with college expenses, to live his final years without the fear of poverty that haunted so many seniors who had trusted their life savings to financial professionals. "I don't know if you realize what you did," Manuel told Rosa, his voice thick with emotion, "but you saved my family's future. My wife can get the medical care she needs. My grandson can go to college, and I can die knowing that I didn't fail to provide for the people I love most." Rosa felt tears she had held back for years finally break through her careful composure. This moment, standing in a community center where her parents had once attended citizenship classes, hearing gratitude from a man whose retirement security she had protected, validated every day of uncertainty she had endured. Every night she had wondered whether her sacrifice would amount to anything more than personal destruction. Aaron watched this exchange with the humility of someone who had learned the difference between wealth and worth through losing everything that had once defined his identity. He understood that Manuel's gratitude represented the kind of success that couldn't be measured in stock portfolios or real estate holdings, the kind of victory that came from protecting people rather than exploiting them. The community center's walls were covered with photographs of local families, graduation announcements from first-generation college students, and announcements for programs that helped working people navigate complex systems designed by and for educated professionals. Rosa realized that she had come full circle from the daughter who had left school to support her family to the woman who now helped other families understand financial systems that could either protect or destroy their dreams. As autumn returned to Chicago, bringing the same gray skies and lake-effect winds that had accompanied Rosa's first encounter with Aaron Blake's conspiracy, she found herself reflecting on the journey that had transformed her from invisible waitress to community advocate. The seasons had turned several times since that October morning when she had overheard Russian conversations about pension fund fraud. But the lessons she had learned about courage, dignity, and the responsibility that comes with witnessing injustice remained as fresh as freshly ground coffee beans. Rosa's story became part of local folklore in Pilsen, told by mothers to daughters who were considering whether to speak up about workplace harassment, by workers who witnessed safety violations but feared retaliation for reporting them, by anyone who had information that could protect others but worried about the personal cost of doing what was right. Her example proved that ordinary people could challenge systems that seemed impossibly powerful, that justice sometimes arrived through the courage of individuals who refused to let fear override their moral obligations. The cafe where Rosa once worked remained a popular gathering place for financial district workers, though none of the current employees knew about the conversation that had taken place there between a millionaire and a waitress, or about the Russian phone call that had started an investigation leading to multiple criminal convictions and the protection of thousands of retirement accounts. The new staff served coffee with professional efficiency, maintaining the same rhythm of morning rush and afternoon conversations that had provided soundtrack to Rosa's 7 years of invisible labor. Sometimes Rosa walked past Café Luna on her way to meetings or community events, pausing to watch through windows that had once framed her daily routine. She felt no bitterness toward the place where she had been happy before circumstances forced her to choose between silence and justice. The cafe had been the stage for her transformation, the location where she had discovered that her grandmother's lessons about dignity and courage were more valuable than any inheritance of money or property. David Chen continued working as a financial journalist, though his experience with Rosa's story had deepened his appreciation for sources who risked personal security to expose wrongdoing. He made a point of treating service workers with extra courtesy, understanding that the people who served his coffee or cleaned his office might possess information that could change the world if someone took the time to listen with respect rather than dismissal. The articles he had written about Aaron Blake's pension fund fraud won several journalism awards, but David always emphasized that the real hero of the story was the anonymous source who had demonstrated that moral courage existed in unexpected places. He never revealed Rosa's identity, even after she gave him permission to use her name, understanding that her anonymity protected other potential whistleblowers who might need to believe that speaking truth to power didn't always require accepting personal destruction as an inevitable consequence. As Rosa entered her 50th year, she reflected on the path that had led her from high school dropout to respected community advocate, from invisible waitress to recognized expert on financial fraud prevention. The journey had required sacrifices that she couldn't have imagined when she was 16 years old and leaving school to support her family. But it had also brought rewards that transcended monetary wealth or social status. Her parents lived comfortably in a modest retirement, supported by the pension benefits that corrupt financiers had tried to steal, and social programs that honest taxation helped fund. Her brother had graduated from college and become a teacher, using the foundation's scholarship program to complete his education without accumulating crushing debt. The family's immigrant story had become one of success, measured not just in economic advancement, but in contribution to community welfare and protection of other vulnerable people. Rosa often visited her grandmother's grave in Graceland Cemetery, bringing flowers and news about the lives that had been changed by lessons learned in a small apartment above a bakery in Pilsen. She spoke to the headstone in Spanish and Russian, reporting on the financial literacy programs, the scholarship recipients, and the network of advocates who had learned that their voices mattered regardless of their job titles or educational credentials. "Abuela," she would say, "you taught me that dignity comes from how we treat others, not from how others treat us. You were right about everything: the courage, the responsibility, the importance of listening when powerful people think no one is paying attention. Your granddaughter has lived a life worthy of the sacrifice you made to bring our family to this country." The wind that carried her words across the cemetery seemed to whisper back in her grandmother's voice, confirming that some legacies transcend individual lifetimes and continue growing through the courage of people who choose to honor the lessons of those who came before them. Rosa's foundation expanded its mission beyond financial literacy to include job training programs for immigrants, scholarship opportunities for children whose parents worked in service industries, and advocacy for policies that protected workers from exploitation by employers who assumed that economic desperation made people willing to accept any treatment rather than risk unemployment. The foundation's offices occupied the ground floor of a building in Little Village, another Chicago neighborhood where Spanish mixed with English on street corners, and families worked multiple jobs to afford rent in a city that seemed designed for people with inherited wealth rather than earned income. Rosa spent her days in meetings with community organizers, policy advocates, and families who needed help navigating systems that seemed intentionally complicated to exclude people who hadn't grown up understanding the unwritten rules of professional advancement. Every person who walked through the foundation's doors reminded Rosa of her younger self, intelligent, hard-working people whose potential had been limited by circumstances rather than ability, whose voices had been dismissed because they lacked credentials that expensive education provided. She saw her teenage self in the young mother who needed job training that would allow her to support her children without working 3 part-time positions, her adult self in the middle-aged man who had witnessed workplace violations but feared reporting them would cost him employment he couldn't afford to lose. These encounters reinforced Rosa's understanding that her story wasn't unique in its circumstances so much as in its outcome. Countless other people possessed information that could protect communities from fraud, corruption, and exploitation, but they rarely found journalists willing to take their testimony seriously or legal systems designed to shield whistleblowers from retaliation. Rosa's success had required not just moral courage, but extraordinary luck in finding David Chen, a reporter whose character matched his professional skills. Recognizing this disparity, Rosa worked with legal advocates to establish a fund that paid for whistleblower protection, helping people who witnessed wrongdoing to hire lawyers and access resources that would allow them to speak truth to power without accepting economic destruction as an inevitable consequence. The fund operated quietly, providing support without publicity that might discourage people from coming forward with sensitive information. The first case the fund supported involved a construction worker who had witnessed safety violations on a public works project that could have resulted in bridge collapse and multiple deaths. The worker's testimony led to criminal charges against contractors who had prioritized profits over public safety, but it also cost him his job and made him unemployable in an industry where word traveled quickly about people who reported violations. The fund provided legal representation, temporary financial support, and job training that allowed him to transition to work in building inspection, where his knowledge of construction shortcuts made him valuable to agencies responsible for public safety. Similar cases followed: a janitor who reported embezzlement at a nonprofit organization, a security guard who witnessed evidence tampering in a criminal case, a restaurant worker who observed health code violations that could have caused food poisoning outbreaks. Each whistleblower faced personal costs for protecting strangers, and each received support that helped them survive the period between doing what was right and finding new employment that valued their integrity rather than punished it. Rosa understood that these individual cases represented a larger pattern of injustice that allowed powerful people to exploit their positions because they assumed that witnesses lacked resources to challenge them. The Foundation's work was essentially about redistributing the power that came with economic security, ensuring that moral courage wasn't exclusive to people who could afford to lose their jobs without facing homelessness or hunger. But the Foundation also attracted opposition from people who benefited from systems that silenced inconvenient witnesses. Rosa received threatening phone calls from anonymous callers who suggested that she was causing trouble for businesses that provided jobs and economic growth. Her car was vandalized twice, and someone threw a brick through the Foundation's office window with a note warning her to stop encouraging people to bite the hands that fed them. These intimidation tactics only strengthened Rosa's resolve, reminding her of Aaron Blake's casual dismissal of the waitress who understood Russian conversations about financial fraud. The people who threatened her were making the same mistake Aaron had made, assuming that someone who had chosen service over self-interest could be frightened into silence by people who valued profit over principle. Rosa increased security at the foundation's offices in her home, but she refused to reduce the program's visibility or effectiveness. She understood that backing down would validate the assumption that working-class advocates could be intimidated more easily than wealthy criminals could be prosecuted. Her grandmother's voice whispered encouragement during the most difficult moments, reminding her that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to do what was right despite being afraid. The foundation's work attracted national attention when a documentary filmmaker produced a movie about Rosa's journey from invisible waitress to financial fraud whistleblower to community advocate. The film, titled Listening While Invisible, premiered at the Sundance Film Festival and was later distributed through streaming services that made it accessible to families who couldn't afford movie tickets but needed to understand that their voices mattered in systems designed to exclude them. Rosa agreed to participate in the documentary reluctantly, understanding that publicity would make her more visible to people who preferred that advocates like her remain silent. But she also recognized that her story could inspire other potential whistleblowers who might assume that challenging powerful people required resources and credentials they didn't possess. The film's most powerful moment came during an interview where Rosa spoke directly to viewers who worked in service industries, who cleaned offices where important decisions were made, who served coffee to people who controlled community resources, who guarded buildings where evidence of corruption might be stored. She reminded them that their proximity to power gave them unique responsibilities to protect people who trusted systems to be honest and fair. "You see things that other people miss," Rosa said, looking directly into the camera. "You hear conversations that powerful people assume no one else understands. You have access to information that could protect your neighbors, your family, your community. Don't let anyone convince you that your voice doesn't matter because you serve coffee or clean offices or guard buildings. Sometimes the most important voices belong to people that powerful men assume are too insignificant to matter." The documentary's release coincided with several high-profile cases of financial fraud, corporate corruption, and political scandal that had been exposed by whistleblowers working in service positions. The stories created a clear pattern: cleaning staff who discovered evidence of tax evasion, security guards who witnessed late-night document shredding, food service workers who overheard conversations about bribing public officials. Each case demonstrated that Rosa's experience was part of a larger system that relied on the silence of people whose work made them invisible to those they served. As Rosa watched her story being presented to audiences across the country, she felt the weight of representation that came with speaking for people who rarely had platforms to tell their own stories. The documentary portrayed her not as a perfect hero, but as an ordinary person who had made an extraordinary choice, someone whose greatest qualification was the willingness to protect strangers from people who would exploit their trust. The film's success led to speaking engagements at universities, community colleges, and worker advocacy organizations, where Rosa shared her story with audiences who needed to understand that justice sometimes required personal sacrifice, but that the sacrifice was worth making when it protected vulnerable people from those who would prey upon them. She spoke in English and Spanish, adapting her message to different communities while maintaining its essential truth, that moral courage could challenge systems that seemed impossibly powerful. At a community college in Los Angeles, Rosa addressed an audience of mostly immigrant women who worked in hotels, restaurants, and private homes throughout the city. She spoke about her grandmother's lessons, her years serving coffee to people who treated her as furniture, and the moment when she realized that silence would make her complicit in crimes against people who deserved honesty from those they trusted with their financial security. During the question and answer period, A young woman raised her hand and asked whether Rosa ever regretted her decision to expose Aaron Blake's fraud. The question carried the weight of personal experience. This was someone who had witnessed wrongdoing but feared the consequences of reporting it, someone who needed to understand whether doing the right thing was worth the personal cost. Rosa thought carefully before answering, remembering the months of unemployment, the fear that she might never find work again, the nights when she wondered whether her sacrifice would amount to anything more than personal destruction. But she also remembered Manuel Rodriguez, thanking her for saving his retirement security, the scholarship recipients who had attended college because the foundation could provide financial support, and the other whistleblowers who had found courage to speak up because her example proved that ordinary people could challenge extraordinary corruption. "I've never regretted protecting people from fraud," Rosa said finally. "I've regretted how hard it was, how much it cost, how alone I felt during the worst periods. But I could never regret doing what my grandmother taught me was right, using my voice to protect people who trusted others to be honest with their life savings." The audience erupted in applause that lasted several minutes, and Rosa understood that her story had given these women permission to believe that their voices mattered, that their proximity to power carried responsibilities as well as risks, and that justice sometimes required ordinary people to make extraordinary choices. After the event, several women approached Rosa to share their own stories of witnessing workplace violations, financial fraud, and exploitation that they had been afraid to report. Each woman carried the weight of information that could protect others, but they also carried the fear of retaliation that could destroy their own economic security. Rosa listened to each story with the same attention David Chen had given her testimony years earlier, understanding that respect for their courage was the first step toward helping them find the resources they needed to act on their moral convictions. These conversations reinforced Rosa's understanding that her foundation's most important work involved creating networks of support that would allow other people to make choices similar to the one she had made in Café Luna. The goal wasn't to encourage everyone to become whistleblowers, but to ensure that people who witnessed serious wrongdoing had access to resources that would help them protect others without accepting personal destruction as an inevitable consequence. Rosa returned to Chicago with renewed commitment to expanding the foundation's reach, understanding that her story's impact would be measured not in awards or recognition, but in the number of other people who found courage to speak truth to power when circumstances required them to choose between silence and justice. The Foundation's 10th anniversary approached during a particularly challenging period in American politics, when powerful people seemed increasingly confident that they could exploit public resources without facing consequences. And when working people seemed increasingly aware that systems designed to protect them were actually designed to benefit those who already possessed wealth and influence. Rosa recognized these tensions as similar to those that had existed when she first overheard Aaron Blake's conspiracy, but multiplied across entire industries and political systems. The anniversary celebration took place in the same community center in Pilsen, where Rosa and Aaron had presented their first financial literacy program together. The walls still displayed photographs of local families and announcements of programs designed to help working people navigate systems created by and for educated professionals. But now they also included thank you letters from scholarship recipients, news articles about successful whistleblower cases, and photographs from speaking events where Rosa had shared her story with audiences who needed to understand that their voices mattered. The evening's program featured testimonies from people who had been helped by the Foundation's programs, workers who had received legal support for reporting violations, families who had benefited from financial literacy education, young people who had attended college because scholarships made higher education financially possible. Each speaker represented the ripple effects that had grown from Rosa's decision to approach David Chen with information about Russian conversations she had overheard while serving coffee to a man who had never bothered to learn her name. But the evening's most moving moment came when Aaron Blake took the stage to address an audience that included many people whose retirement savings had been protected by Rosa's courage and his eventual cooperation with federal investigators. His appearance had been controversial. Some community members argued that reformed criminals shouldn't be given platforms at events celebrating justice. But Rosa had insisted that redemption required acknowledgement of wrongdoing as well as commitment to making amends. 10 years ago, I was the kind of person who treated service workers like furniture, Aaron began, his voice carrying none of the arrogance that had once defined his interactions with people he considered beneath his social status. I dismissed Rosa Martinez as insignificant because she served coffee instead of managing investment portfolios. I assumed that her uniform meant she lacked intelligence, that her accent meant she couldn't understand complex financial conversations, that her economic position meant her voice didn't matter in decisions that affected thousands of people's retirement security. He paused, looking directly at Manuel Rodriguez and other community members whose pension funds had been targeted by his fraud scheme. I was wrong about everything. Rosa possessed the moral courage that my wealth couldn't purchase and the integrity that my success had gradually corrupted. She risked her livelihood to protect strangers from crimes I was planning to commit against people who had trusted me with their life savings. Aaron's testimony lasted 20 minutes, detailing the arrogance that had made him assume he could exploit people's trust without consequences, and the personal destruction that had followed his arrest and conviction. But he also spoke about the education he had received from his collaboration with Rosa on community programs, the lessons he had learned about dignity, respect, and the responsibility that comes with access to other people's financial resources. The foundation that bears Rosa's name has taught me that wealth without character is worthless, Aaron concluded, and that true success comes from protecting people rather than exploiting them. I can never undo the harm I intended to cause, but I can spend the rest of my life trying to prevent others from making the same mistakes I made when I thought money mattered more than human decency. The audience's response was mixed. Some applauded Aaron's apparent transformation, while others remained skeptical that someone who had been willing to steal retirement savings could become a genuine advocate for the people he had previously viewed as victims. But Rosa understood that redemption was a process rather than an event, and that Aaron's ongoing work with the foundation represented his commitment to earning forgiveness through action rather than words. As the evening concluded, and community members shared food and conversation in the same room where Rosa's parents had once attended citizenship classes, Rosa reflected on the journey that had brought her from invisible waitress to recognized advocate for people whose voices were often dismissed because they lacked credentials that expensive education provided. She thought about her grandmother's lessons about dignity, courage, and the responsibility that comes with witnessing injustice. She thought about the Russian conversations she had understood because of linguistic gifts that had crossed oceans and generations to reach a Chicago coffee shop where powerful people assumed no one was listening. She thought about the choice she had made to approach David Chen with information that could either save thousands of people from financial fraud or destroy her own carefully constructed life. Most importantly, Rosa thought about the letters she continued receiving from people who had been inspired by her story to find their own voices when faced with moral choices that tested their character against their comfort. These letters came from across the country and sometimes from around the world. Cleaning staff who had reported safety violations, security guards who had witnessed evidence tampering, food service workers who had observed health code violations that could have caused public health emergencies. Each letter represented someone who had learned that their proximity to power came with unique responsibilities to protect people who trusted systems to be honest and fair. Each writer had decided that doing what was right was worth the personal risk, that protecting strangers was more important than protecting their own economic security, that justice sometimes required ordinary people to make extraordinary sacrifices. As Rosa prepared to leave the community center where her story had come full circle, she noticed a young woman cleaning tables and emptying trash cans while the celebration continued around her. The woman worked efficiently and professionally, moving through the room with the same invisible grace that Rosa had once brought to serving coffee at Café Luna. Their eyes met across the room, and Rosa saw recognition flash between them. Two women who had learned that service work carried dignity that couldn't be diminished by others' failure to acknowledge it. Rosa approached the young woman and introduced herself, explaining that she had once worked in food service and understood the challenges that came with being invisible to people who depended on your labor, but rarely bothered to recognize your humanity. The woman, whose name was Carmen and who had immigrated from Guatemala 5 years earlier, listened with the careful attention that service workers learn to give to anyone who spoke to them with genuine respect. "Do you ever hear things that seem important?" Rosa asked, thinking of her grandmother's lessons about the responsibility that comes with witnessing wrongdoing. "Do customers or employers ever discuss things that you think might affect other people negative?" Rosa asked, thinking of her grandmother's lessons about the responsibility that comes with witnessing wrongdoing. "Do customers or employers ever discuss things that you think might affect other people negatively?" Carmen's expression shifted from polite attention to nervous recognition, and Rosa understood that this young woman had indeed overheard conversations that troubled her conscience. They talked quietly while Carmen continued her work, and Rosa learned that Carmen cleaned offices at a construction company where she had heard supervisors discussing the use of substandard materials in public projects. The conversations were in English, which Carmen understood better than her supervisors assumed, and they suggested that bridges and schools were being built with materials that wouldn't meet safety standards. Rosa felt her heartbeat accelerate with familiar urgency. Recognizing the moment when an ordinary person discovered that their invisible position had given them access to information that could protect countless strangers from harm. She thought of her grandmother's voice, whispering about courage and responsibility, of her own terror when she had first approached David Chen with Russian conversations about pension fund fraud, of the personal cost she had paid for choosing justice over job security. "Would you like to talk more about this?" Rosa asked, offering Carmen the same respect that David Chen had shown her years earlier. "There are people who can help investigate what you've heard, and there are resources to protect you if you decide that reporting violations is the right thing to do." Carmen looked around the community center. Seeing walls covered with photographs of successful families and announcements of programs that helped working people challenge systems designed to exclude them. She saw evidence that ordinary people could make extraordinary differences when they found the courage to use their voices for protection rather than silence, that invisible workers possessed power that their employers never suspected. "I'm scared," Carmen admitted, her voice carrying the same uncertainty that Rosa had felt when contemplating whether to expose Aaron Blake's conspiracy. "But I think about the children who will use those bridges, the students who will attend those schools. If something happens and I stayed quiet." Her voice trailed off, but Rosa understood the weight of responsibility that Charlotte was accepting. This young immigrant woman was discovering what Rosa had learned years earlier, that witnessing wrongdoing created moral obligations that transcended concerns about personal security, that protecting strangers sometimes required sacrifices that seemed impossibly difficult. Rosa gave Carmen her business card and invited her to visit the Foundation's offices when she was ready to discuss her options. She explained the Whistleblower Protection Fund, the legal resources available to people who reported violations, and the network of advocates who had learned that speaking truth to power required community support rather than individual heroism. As Rosa walked through the familiar streets of Pilsen toward her apartment, she felt the continuity that connected her grandmother's immigrant journey to her own story of moral courage, to Carmen's emerging understanding that invisible workers could protect vulnerable people from those who would exploit their powerlessness. The neighborhood streets held the footsteps of generations who had learned that dignity required active protection of community welfare rather than passive acceptance of injustice. Rosa understood that her story would continue through people like Carmen, that her foundation's work would expand through individuals who found courage to challenge systems that seemed impossibly powerful, that justice would advance through the accumulated choices of ordinary people who decided that protecting others was worth personal sacrifice. She thought of her grandmother's photograph waiting on her kitchen table, surrounded by letters from scholarship recipients and articles about financial fraud prevention and thank you notes from families whose retirement savings had been protected by a waitress who had been brave enough to approach a journalist with information overheard in Russian. The continuing story would honor every lesson about dignity and responsibility that had crossed oceans and generations to reach a Chicago coffee shop where powerful people had assumed no one important was listening. The autumn wind carried memory and promise as Rosa continued home, understanding that some stories never truly end but instead multiply through the courage of people who learn that their voices matter regardless of their job titles, educational credentials, or social status. Her grandmother's ultimate gift hadn't been language or cultural knowledge, but the understanding that individual choices about courage and character could change the world for people who deserved protection from those who would exploit their trust. 3 blocks from her apartment, Rosa's phone rang with a call from David Chen, who had been covering a City Hall corruption scandal and needed advice about protecting a source who worked in building maintenance and had witnessed evidence of bribery in public contracts. The conversation reminded Rosa that her journey from invisible waitress to community advocate was part of a larger story about justice that required constant vigilance and ongoing courage from people who chose to listen when powerful figures assumed no one was paying attention. She smiled as she answered David's call, understanding that some conversations changed everything and that the most important words were often spoken in languages that powerful people assumed nobody else could understand. Her grandmother's voice whispered encouragement across years and continents, reminding her that courage multiplied when ordinary people decided that protecting others was worth extraordinary sacrifice. And you, have you ever been dismissed as insignificant while possessing knowledge that could change everything? Have you ever served others who treated you like part of the furniture, never imagining that you could understand their secrets or threaten their carefully constructed worlds? Have you ever wondered whether doing the right thing was worth the personal cost, whether justice was possible when power seemed stacked against people like you? Tell me your story in the comments below. If Rosa's journey from invisible waitress to reluctant hero touched your heart, please leave a like and subscribe so this story reaches another working woman who deserves to know that her dignity and courage matter more than anyone else's wealth or status. For more stories about ordinary people finding extraordinary strength, click the podcast link to the left. Thank you for walking this emotional path with us, for remembering that the most important conversations often happen in languages that powerful people assume no one else understands, and for believing that justice sometimes arrives through the courage of someone whose greatest qualification is the willingness to listen when others choose to remain silent. We'll see you in our next story, where invisible heroes discover that their voices can change the world.